Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books are sold, including BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports. Welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm your co-host, Dan Newman. I'm joined, as always, by my brother and co-host, Andrew Newman. He will be along in just a second here. We have a little bit of a first here tonight. We've done interviews before. We've done author interviews before. And we've even done interviews with more than one author at a time before. But what we have not done is be two brothers who are interviewing two brothers. And we are lucky to have with us tonight Matt and Mark Jacob, the co-authors of Globetrotter, How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports. Mark Jacob is the co-author of 8 books about sports history and photography. He is the former Metro editor of the Chicago Tribune and created the newspaper's popular 10 Things You Might Not Know history feature. His articles have been published in Library Quarterly, Chicago Reader, Chicago Magazine, and Chicago History Magazine. He is a former adjunct professor at Northwestern University. And Matthew Jacob is the co-author of What the Great Ate, A Curious History of Food and Fame with his brother Mark. He started his career as a journalist, working as a sports writer and a city council reporter, receiving awards from the Arkansas Press Association. Jacob is a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, SABR, which you hear me talk about often, and has written for such outlets as the Boston Globe, Detroit Free Press, Los Angeles Times, and USA Today. Thank you both for joining us to talk about your book.
Thanks for having us.
And Andrew, how are you doing today?
I am doing well. I am joining us from the side of Route 84 in lovely Danbury, Connecticut. I was unable to make it home in time for our recording session, so I will just sit here and hope the police don't inquire as to what I'm doing, and I have to explain I'm doing a podcast.
So Abe Saperstein, I was really enjoyed the book. Was really sort of struck. I think I knew sort of the basic outlines of his story, but one of the things that I was really struck by as I was going through the book was just how many great figures from sort of mid-20th century sports interacted with Saperstein in one way or another. Everybody from George Halas to George Steinbrenner, Satchel Paige, Bill Veeck, Jackie Robinson, Wilt Chamberlain, Bob Gibson, sort of Jerry Lucas, these names just sort of keep coming to mind. So why don't you sort of, for those who may not be familiar, tell us a little bit about Abe Saperstein and what made you want to tell his story?
Matt, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So my brother and I, as you mentioned, Dan, had co-authored a book back in 2010. In the interim, Mark had been a co-author on a book that was a historical biography. And, I was telling him later, I said, yeah, we should write another book, and I would love to find a biography to write. And the irony is we kind of stumbled on this. A good friend of Mark's sort of threw this out to him when they were talking. Hey, have you heard about Abe Saperstein? And I think, both of us sort of like you, well, yeah, I was associated with the Globetrotters basketball team, but we really didn't know that much about him. And I think it brought additional interest for Mark because Mark has, been a Chicago resident now for 40 years or so. So, I mean, he's a dyed-in-the-wool Chicagoan. And so the fact this guy was an immigrant who grew up not that far from where he lives today certainly brought some interest. But I think the thing that I keep coming back to is, we started digging into this, well, what about this guy? And Mark would go read a newspaper article. I would interview somebody who was a player, an associate, and we would kind of check back in on the phone or texting, and we had the same reaction, which was, you know what this article says? We would share the information, and then we would say, how is it that nobody wrote a biography about this guy? And then, the more Mark and I read about the 3-point shot in basketball and how that was something that Saperstein pioneered, we had kind of the same reaction. How do you not have a biography on the shelf somewhere about this guy who made so many contributions? And as you mentioned, Dan, across the lines, basketball, baseball, and I think really his legacy goes beyond those sports because he viewed all sports really as more of a show than just a game. But I think, every week we kind of dug into this guy and said, well, let's see, is there a biography here? We came back with a resounding yes. I don't know, Mark, you jump in on there. What am I missing?
Yeah, well, it's just he was in so many things. He helped keep the Negro Leagues going financially. He helped keep the NBA going financially in his early years by doing double headers with the Globetrotters, because people look at the NBA today as some kind of real cash cow. Back then it wasn't. Back then their teams were falling off all the time. It was really struggling, and they did double headers with the Globetrotters. And the Globetrotters were so popular that those were the NBA's biggest grossing games. And at first they would have the Globetrotters play first, and then they'd have a league game after. But so many people left after the Globetrotters played that they switched it around and had had the Globetrotters play second, so that there'd be a crowd there for the NBA game as the first game. That's how popular Globetrotters were and how important it was to the NBA. And Matt did this fascinating research at the National Archives looking at State Department records, and the Globetrotters were really important to the State Department as a diplomatic tool, as a propaganda tool, really overseas to try to thwart Soviet propaganda about racial discrimination in the U.S. He found State Department records showing that they wanted to use the Globetrotters to try to show that that racism in the U.S. had been overrated. So there are all these angles to this, and the 3-point shot. Almost nobody knows where the 3-point shot came from, and Abe Saperstein pioneered it. He was the first person to ever use it in a league, and it might not have ever happened. We might not have a 3-point shot if it weren't for Abe Saperstein.
Yeah, arguably the most significant rule change in professional basketball the last 50 years. Maybe the shot clock, but they had the shot clock goes back a little before then, of course. But yeah, just a huge change.
Yeah, and I would agree with that definitely. And it's funny because reading this, it was sort of one sort of book for like the first 80% of it. It was a lot about sort of the Globetrotters and in some ways the story of the black athlete, the Negro Leagues, and all these things in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and the story of the immigrant coming from the UK to live in, which we didn't mention it yet, but the Abe Saperstein, born in the United Kingdom, and eventually he and his family come to America and settle in Chicago. And then it was funny because then it was almost like a last minute switch up. And then the last 30 to 40 pages are about these sort of on the court innovations, particularly the 3-point shot. And we talked a little bit about that, Andrew and I, a couple years ago. We did an episode about sort of rival leagues to the NBA. And one of the leagues we talked about was the Saperstein's league, the early 60s, the American Basketball League. But yeah, I would say it definitely is the most important on the court innovation other than the shot clock. Basketball, I think it was something like in the 1980 finals, which was LA and Philly, which was the first year of the 3-point shot. I think there was something like 4 3-pointers shot in the whole. Nowadays, you turn on the NBA finals and Curry shoots that in the first 90 seconds. So yeah, even if you put aside all the societal stuff, all of the things with the Globetrotters and how that influenced not just the game, but culture, put aside all the role he had in bringing some of the early black players to Major League Baseball. This is the guy who maybe more than other is responsible for really what the modern NBA is. And that's just crazy to think about.
Yeah, and you could probably even say WNBA, right? Because I mean, not only Steph Curry, but Caitlin Clark owes a little debt of gratitude to him, because we know that that's such a powerful part of her game offensively, and I mean, it's just changed the whole pace of the game. And it's kind of funny. I mean, Mark really dug in a little more to this part of the story, and can talk more about it, but. Saperstein's motivation for doing it, I think, was probably a little bit twofold. But one was just he wanted a gimmick. Everything he did, he was always looking for something new. Give the fans something new, a novelty, a gimmick, something they haven't seen before. So the idea of a three-point shot just kind of appealed on that basic level. But I think the other thing is he complained at times about big guys in basketball. He didn't want them to be too dominant. And so I think for him, there was this sense of kind of an equalizer, of allowing a three-point shot. Suddenly, you couldn't just kind of crowd the lane so much, and it gave smaller players a little more relevance in the game, perhaps. But Mark,
Hey, well, Matt, you didn't mention
this
that.
a lot.
You didn't mention that Abe was 5'3" himself. He may be the shortest player in the Basketball Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And Abe was an athlete when he was in high school. In fact, he wore a uniform under his suit when the Globetrotters first went out there. So that if somebody fouled out or was injured, he could play. And occasionally he would play. But of course, he wasn't, up to playing at the level that the Globetrotters played at. Talking about the three-point shot, and Abe was a visionary. And the more we learned as we did research on this book, the more we found out just how far ahead of sports he was, of what was considered acceptable in sports, and there was a lot of hidebound ownership of sports, of course, as you know. But Abe Saperstein was an early promoter of night games in baseball. He was complaining about how slow Major League Baseball games were, and how that was annoying to the fans. This was, in recent years, they've tried to speed up the baseball games, but Abe was complaining about that in the 1950s. He also was pushing for variable ticket pricing, if a real popular team came to town, you'd charge more for the tickets. And which is something that sports teams have picked up on only in recent decades. And their studies show that they missed out on millions of dollars per year by not picking up on that. And Saperstein was pushing that in the 1950s. He was also pushing for expansion of baseball and basketball to the West Coast. And the NBA was very slow to get a team, west of Minneapolis for years. And Abe was begging them to let him have a team in Los Angeles. And instead, the NBA kind of double-crossed him by letting the Minneapolis Lakers move to Los Angeles, which is kind of why Saperstein started the American Basketball League in the first place, is the NBA didn't take him seriously and wouldn't give him a franchise.
And it seems like you mentioned how slow they were to expand to the West Coast. It seems like the thing that finally lit a fire under their rear ends was that they needed to beat him to the West Coast. So it's interesting, had he not been there, how long would it have taken them to actually end up with a team in California?
Well, yeah, the thing about it is that because Saperstein had a traveling team, they didn't have any home court, and they traveled the West Coast a lot, especially the Pacific Northwest. And so he knew how popular basketball was becoming on the West Coast. And the NBA was just so kind of focused on New York and Boston and Philadelphia that they just didn't think about it. And they were missing out on so much opportunity. Now, Saperstein he couldn't get it together to get his league started for the 60-61 season. And so the Lakers got into Los Angeles a year before the Los Angeles Jets in the ABL got there. And so Saperstein, his league's team had the worst venue, and it didn't have quite the star players. And so he lost out. I mean, the ABL was a financial disaster for Saperstein. He lost at least $250,000 in money at the time, which would be a lot more today. And people called it a spite league. They said he was just mad at the NBA, so he started it. But I think he just wanted to try new things. The thing that I think Matt and I really learned from this book is that Abe Saperstein was one of the most daring, audacious, creative people in sports of the last century. I mean, just he was not afraid to fail, and he did fail sometimes. And but he created all these new things. He was an innovator in halftime shows in basketball. He had a truncated version of a Broadway show that he presented at halftime one season, and that traveled with him. And he had ping pong games. He had Althea Gibson, the famous tennis star. She traveled with him one summer and did a miniature kind of tennis match. He had acrobats. He had all kinds of stuff. I mean, he there was nothing he wouldn't try. And so sports at the time, there were a lot of purists who didn't want anything that would seem to be showy for the fans. They were just hidebound. They just were very conservative. And Abe was exactly the opposite and was not afraid to try things. And so telling the story of Abe Saperstein is a real look into both society and sports of the middle of the last century, and especially race relations and all that. We just learned so much. And the book says so much that has never been said in a book before. That's one of the things that I think we're most thrilled is that this isn't just a recounting of stuff that's been in other books. We break news in this book.
I was going to say, I think because you brought up the race aspect, and what I appreciated was that this story could be told, Abe Saperstein's race relations with the Black community, depending on your point of view, could be told all from one way or all from the other way. He was just an opportunist. He was exploiting Black stereotypes, or he gave, opportunities decades before a lot of other people were willing to do so. As with most things, the truth is a much more nuanced look at it. And I thought this you guys did a great job in terms of saying, well, yeah, there's this quote he gave that, doesn't age particularly well, but he was trying to, just taking it from sort of a detailed look instead of the fortune cookie, he was a racist or he was a visionary aspect of it.
Yeah, Andrew, I appreciate the compliment because, we really wanted to get that right. And Mark and I do not believe in a world that's populated by heroes and villains. I mean, this is very complicated, and Black America, I think, is better off because Abe Saperstein, had this idea of forming a basketball team. Does that mean that everything that he did and everything that he said, goes over really smoothly and doesn't make you wince a little bit? No. There were times when he said things. He was a man of his time, and I think we had to acknowledge that. And there were times when he said things to his ball players that would make people today wince and scratch their heads. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that. But I think you try and look at it in its totality, and the fact is, this man's best friend was Inman Jackson, who was an original Globetrotter and over time took on more of a managerial role. At one point, the Globetrotters had 3 squads. At one point, there was a Globetrotter squad in Wichita, Kansas, one in South America, and one in Western Europe. I mean, that's just how massive this enterprise became. And so, Abe didn't have time to travel with all these teams. Obviously, he can't travel with all 3. Sometimes he couldn't even travel fully with any one of them. And so people like Inman Jackson were his right hand. And, you look at, he elevated a lot of Black men into leadership roles that went beyond simply being one of his players. And, I think it demonstrates a trust. The guy had felt a comfort level around Black people in Chicago in the 1920s at a time when white guys were not hanging out with Black guys very much, right? They just weren't. And so that in and of itself is somewhat astonishing.
Yeah, the Manny Jackson, who wrote the foreword for our book, was the former Globetrotter player who later was very successful in the corporate world and ended up buying the Globetrotters and owning them. From the mid-90s for about a decade. He was the main guy. And he wrote the foreword to our book. And he said that Black players considered Abe to be kind of a go-between between them and the white world. And because Abe was Jewish and had experienced anti-Semitism, I mean, I think he was in a kind of a unique role that way. And it's when we were trying to like judge Abe, and because he did say inappropriate things sometimes, and he did, and players grumbled. Some of the players grumbled about how much they were paid. But, as Matt pointed out when we were talking about it, Major League Baseball players of that era had jobs during the off season. They were like salesmen and stuff during the off season because nobody was getting paid that much. And so Abe Saperstein was an owner. I mean, he was trying to, make a business go. So he wasn't going to like be giving away money. But the truth is, I came around to the fact that Abe Saperstein could have made a lot more money than he made. And Matt, you did a lot of research on, on Satchel Paige, and
Yeah.
and how much he got paid. And Abe helped to make him rich.
Yeah, I mean, there's very good reason to believe that Satchel Paige was in the early 40s, at least at one point during that front part of that decade, the highest paid pitcher in all of baseball, black or white.
Let me just interrupt you there, Matt, and just kind of give you a plug. Matt gave a presentation at the Sabre conference about a month ago with a lot of data and figures to back that assertion up. So that's not just a simple sort of, hey, we think it might have been the case. There really is, right, Matt, some real significant dollars and cents evidence that Page may have been the highest paid pitcher in baseball in the early 40s.
Yeah. I mean, the guy did kind of work 7 days a week as well. I think, you guys know. I mean, he was one of those one of a kind guys. I mean, he really wanted to monetize his talent. He was probably one of the original free agents before the term really existed. I mean, because he would walk out on contracts, and he was so talented and was so good for the gate that his owners would forgive him and say, "All right, never mind, come back."
And so the audience knows a little bit what was the relationship between Saperstein and Satchel Paige?
Yeah, so it's not clear when they met, probably early 30s when Satchel Paige briefly pitched for a team called the Cleveland Cubs. There I go. I'm thinking Chicago. There was a franchise called the Cleveland Cubs. Didn't last long in a colored baseball league in the Northeast. And I think that this guy and Abe clicked immediately, right? Because Saperstein recognized not just talent, but showmanship. And one of the things that historians tell us about Satchel Paige is the guy wasn't just an amazing hurler. He was quite an act. I mean, he had a comedic element to him. He would engage in pantomimes with the fans. He would rotate his arms like a windmill right before he delivered a pitch occasionally. And he would saunter out to the mound in a very showy kind of way. I mean, the guy had style and showmanship, incredibly so. And I think Abe appreciated that, and Abe knew that was also an added selling point. So Abe had a close relationship with the Kansas City Monarchs. Satchel Paige pitched with the Monarchs, not all his career, but several seasons. And they actually had two squads. One of them was a barnstorming squad. All it did was play non-league games. It would travel to Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska and Minnesota and all these other states and play games. And Saperstein described, during one interview, he described Satchel Paige as what he called a, quote, individual proposition.
I love this.
It was a fancy way of saying, if the Monarchs take the field, that's going to cost you this amount. If Satchel Paige takes the mound and pitches, it's going to cost you an additional amount. And usually that was even just 2 or 3 innings, right? They wouldn't guarantee that he was going to pitch more than 2 or 3 innings, but he really monetized his value. He was the one who arranged for Satchel Paige of all places to pitch semi-pro baseball in North Dakota for 2 seasons, and he made a lot of money relative to average incomes at that time.
And Saperstein is the reason that Satchel Paige made it into the major leagues. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, the guy's 42 years old. And Bill Veeck and Saperstein had a very good relationship for many, many years. They both hail from Chicago. And Bill Veeck, as you all know, great disruptor himself. Definitely somebody who believed in bending or ignoring the rules whenever it made sense to him. But he asked Saperstein, "What do you think of Satchel Paige? I mean, should we bring him in?" And what Veeck was really looking for at that point wasn't a starter. He wanted somebody to help out in the bullpen.
Mhm.
The Indians were losing a lot of games in 1948 late. And they were right in the thick of things. And so, he said, has he got it right? And Saperstein really said, yeah, I think he's going to be a value. The Sporting News just absolutely lampooned the decision, said it was silly. This is a PR gimmick. Why would you sign him? At the end of the season, Satchel Paige goes 6-1 for the Indians. And boy, it really mattered because they ended the regular season tied with the Red Sox. They play a 1-game playoff to make it to the World Series. Then they play the other team in Boston, the Braves, and end up winning that. But Page was, his net 5 wins certainly mattered in that season.
There's a great moment from the radio broadcast. Page only got into 1 game in that World Series, and I think it was game 5, and the Indians won the series, like Matt was saying, but they lost whatever game it was Page pitched in. They were losing big, and they brought Page in, and the radio broadcast is available online. People can look it up, and the ovation for Page I think it was in Cleveland. I'm not 100%. I think the game was in Cleveland, and the ovation that he gets. So it was definitely a popular move both at the box office and on the field. And, so many of those guys, the names that baseball fans know, the cool Papa Bells and the Judy Johnsons and the Oscar Charleston, Josh Gibson, obviously, and Buck Leonard, never got into the majors. A few did, and a few a few had sort of very brief cups of coffee, and I think you all even talk about I think who was it, Luke Easter played a little bit with the St. Louis Browns, but lasted like a month for various reasons of health and racism and everything else. But Page not only made it to the major leagues, he performed, he won a World Series. He was the first he and Doby together were the first black players to win a World Series. So it was nice that Page, with a lot of help from Saperstein, among others, was really able to get into and actually contribute in Major League Baseball for a period of time, at least.
At the age of 42.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or at least.
Yeah.
Well, what is it, Matt? Didn't Satchel Paige say that he couldn't ascertain his real age because a goat had eaten the family Bible or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, both he and Saperstein were so eminently quotable. I mean, that's one reason why sports writers love them. I mean, they would really come up with great stories, clever anecdotes, and were very quotable. And, look, both Mark and I have spent some time, at least, in the journalism world. And one thing you got to do is, speaking figuratively today, of course, because it's all online, but you got to fill pages. You need ink. And you got to find people who you can talk to and write those columns and write those articles. So those two guys were just gold, when it came to sports writers.
And I think sort of like we touched on with Saperstein being, willing to maybe use some of the racial attitudes or stereotypes at the time to market his team. Page, in a lot of ways, was also, we talked about how shrewd a pitcher he was, or shrewd a businessman he was, but he would also sort of exploit that sleepy Southerner, guy to endear himself, but at the same time being that individual proposition who was getting X amount of dollars at the gate for appearing to pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. There's pretty good evidence that he and Doby were not best friends on the Indians. They were just totally different players. Satchel Paige was on the sunset of his career. Doby was early on. Doby was like, I'm going to follow all the rules. This is what you do. You show up at the ballpark early. Satchel Paige would arrive 2 minutes before he was supposed to take the mound. And, they were just two very different ball players. But yeah, Page just had a one-of-a-kind personality.
So I want to sort of make sure that we get a little bit to sort of, I guess, what you'd call the main thrust here. And I look at it as sort of, I'm talking to my wife before I come down, and she says, who are you, who are you interviewing? What's the book? And so, Saperstein is known best as the guy, and you talk in the book about how even this may not be true, but he's talked about as the guy who formed the Harlem Globetrotters. So I guess my question is, first of all, is that true? And to what extent is that true? And then, just tell us a little bit about how the Harlem Globetrotters came about and Abe Saperstein's role in that whole creation.
Well, Saperstein had some role in a team called the Savoy Big Five that started in the Savoy Ballroom on the south side of Chicago. Now, there's a lot of mythology about that. Saperstein said that the team started, their first game was in January 1927. That's almost certainly not true. And some people think that Saperstein came up with that story only so that he could, 20 years later, have a 20th anniversary tour. That could have been just a simple white lie for that reason. But it's stuck, to where the Globetrotters today claim that as their first game. But it just doesn't, it makes no sense. The Savoy Ballroom wasn't even built at the time. So the predecessor team for the Globetrotters certainly wasn't around then. So the Savoy Ballroom has the Savoy Big Five, and Abe had some role with them, but it's not really clear what. He made, to some extent, these black athletes. Abe was, to be really clear about this, Abe worked for the Parks Commission in Chicago, and that allowed him to meet athletes and coaches throughout Chicago area. Remember, this is the 1920s. This is shortly after the famous race riot in Chicago in 1919. So it wasn't like black and white people in Chicago were real friendly. But Abe broke through barriers like that. And so when he's working for the Parks Commission, coaching basketball and baseball, he meets these black athletes and really gets on with them. And so he becomes very friendly with some of these, like Fritz Pollard, famous NFL star who was black. Mm-hmm. And he hangs out with them. They realize that he's just this gregarious guy who can meet people and get things done, and they want him to arrange games for them to play in Wisconsin and Michigan and various other places. So the Savoy Big Five breaks up. Then there's a team from one of the players called named Tommy Brookins, who was at the same time a great basketball player on the South Side, but also was a nightclub singer, and he started a team called Tommy Brookins Globetrotters. And by the way, Globetrotters wasn't anything that Abe invented or Tommy Brookins. There were various teams at the time called the Globetrotters. And so Tommy Brookins Globetrotters play, and they're playing a game in Wisconsin, and somebody comes up to him afterward and says, hey, and Abe Saperstein is booking all their games in Wisconsin and Michigan. And someone comes up with to Tommy Brookins and says, hey, you guys were great the other night. I saw you in LaCroix. And he says, we didn't go there. We've never played there. And so one of the other Globetrotters players comes up to Tommy Brookins and says, hey, I was meaning to tell you this, but Abe Saperstein started a second team that's also touring. This was, and this later became, as Matt said, a Globetrotter thing where they would have 3 teams out, or 2 or 3 teams out on the road at the same time. Anyway, they did it without Tommy Brookins' knowledge, and he was really ticked at Abe for a very short time. But then he realized that he had an offer for $75 a week singing in a nightclub, and plus his mom wasn't feeling that well, and he wanted to stick around in Chicago. So he said, okay, Abe, I don't care. I'm not going to do this anymore. You do it. And that's kind of how Abe Saperstein took over these touring black players. And Tommy Brookins, he didn't hold any grudges. He and Abe actually became, were lifelong friends. And Tommy Brookins later in the 60s gave him advice on, in the 50s, gave him advice on how to tour in Europe. And anyway, so Tommy Brookins gives him uniforms, and Abe's on the road, and that's when he started the team. And the most likely date when they started was in January 1929, not 27. And that works out with, as far as when you start seeing news stories about them and when some of the players graduate from high school and things like that. So it makes way more sense to think that happened. Not that it's a big deal which year it was, But we were trying to do fact checking because Abe Saperstein made up a lot of stuff. He made up that he was he went to the University of Illinois, and he probably didn't. We checked with the University of Illinois office that tracks that stuff, and they said no record of him. So he said that all his players were we called them college Negroes because that obviously black people were called Negroes at the time, and I think that he made that up because they weren't. They just weren't. They were mostly kids out of high school, and he made that up because I think he wanted to reassure these small white town people that that he was bringing upstanding individuals to play there. And so there were a lot of white lies like that Abe told. And Abe said that he was on a famous team in Cleveland, the Rosenblums, which won a title in the early 20s, or 3 titles, but one of them, we checked out every clip we could find on the Rosenblums, and there's no sign of Abe Saperstein ever playing for them. But he used to say that, and he's dropped that from his resume later in his career when, there was no internet then, so you couldn't check out things. So it was easier to lie to small town newspapers. And so Abe was fake it till you make it kind of guy. He said he had the best team in the world when he clearly didn't, but then he finally at one point did have the best team in the world.
Yeah, that 1948 game against the Minneapolis Lakers was just a huge that was a real wake-up call, I think, to a lot of people about the talent of black basketball players.
That was a game that they played in the Chicago Stadium against the Minneapolis Lakers. Everyone thought they were the best team in the world, and by that time, the Globetrotters had really had a reputation as a show team more than a serious basketball team, even though they were a terrific basketball team also. And everyone thought they were going to get trounced by the Minneapolis Lakers, who had George Mikan. Everyone thought he was the best player around.
The first dynasty in professional, or maybe the first dynasty in NBA history. When you hear a list of dynasties, that's the first one. And Mikan is the first, all-time great NBA player.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the Globetrotters beat them on a last-second shot in Chicago Stadium, and that's in 1948. And some people, basketball historians, think that's the key moment when it became clear that the NBA had to integrate, and that this whole mythology, which it's hard to believe when you look at the NBA today and how dominated by black athletes it is, that some people thought back in the middle of the last century that black players really weren't very good team players, and that they always choked in the clutch. Those were things that were said about black athletes back then, and that's why Abe Saperstein is so important, because he was blowing up myths like that.
Yeah, it obviously shouldn't have been said or thought in any sport or walk of life, but it's particularly hard to believe given who won MVP for the next 60 years. It was never something that anybody thought in basketball.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It was just, that was a real wake up call. And, I think the other thing though, and I think we may have alluded to it briefly, was this team gained such stature, even after the NBA really started to draft and bring in black players, the team still had a tremendous brand. And so much so that when the Cold War is really peaking, the U.S. State Department is working behind the scenes to get the Globetrotters to tour more countries and helping them extraordinarily behind the scenes in ways that, the average journalist or American was just not aware of. I mean, in some cases, embassies were printing tickets for them, doing publicity and drafting press releases for them, because they really recognized what I think a lot of countries recognize, which is sports teams and athletes are generally not viewed through a political lens. So they can kind of have an effect and shape attitudes without seeming to be so overtly political. And so Secretary of State Dean Acheson told in 1952, he sends a memo to every embassy in the U.S. across the globe saying, here's their itinerary, here's the countries they're visiting. If they're coming to your country, you must extend to them all appropriate courtesies and assistance. So that was his way of saying, be on the lookout, right? And yeah, it was a pretty interesting relationship they built for several years.
It's hard to almost impossible. We were not able to measure exactly how much impact the Globetrotters had in spreading basketball worldwide as a popular sport, but it's indisputable that they were a key factor in that. They were going to countries in which they didn't really know much about basketball at all before the Globetrotters came, and Matt did most of the research on their foreign trips. And remember, in England, they said that, well, there's this game called basketball. It's kind of like the netball that schoolgirls
Yeah.
play here in England.
Yeah. The manager of Wembley Stadium in London actually tried to counsel Saperstein against coming. I mean, right? Not what you typically see, right? I want to take your money, but he said to him, look, it won't fly here. I vaguely know what you mean, but and at the time in Britain, the closest cousin to basketball was a game called netball that was basically played by middle school girls. And so that was their whole context for it. And Saperstein astutely and politely ignored his advice and said, no, book us. And they ended up having to add another game because they were selling out. So, I mean, it was, but Saperstein his whole life, sometimes he shrugged off bad advice. Other times he shrugged off some good advice, but he was a defiant guy.
He could have, yeah. He said one of the biggest mistakes he ever made in his life is he had a chance to buy the San Francisco 49ers football team in the NFL. And he decided at the last minute not to do it. And that was one of his big regrets. That was like, because he didn't have much to do with football. The thing about it, guys, is that Saperstein had his thumb in a lot of things. He started a lacrosse league in the Chicago area. He was promoting soccer. He did ladies basketball. He was I don't know when he slept. He may not have slept, Matt. I mean, I wonder about that. I mean, because there's this one anecdote in the book where he calls a sports writer up at 2 a.m. and he just wants to talk about how he doesn't think his team's performing that well lately, and wonders what he should do. This is at 2 a.m. I mean, it's like when did the guy sleep?
It's interesting, too, because he really did, the three major sports leagues of the United States, even to this day, MLB, NFL, NBA. He never owns a team in any of them, but he comes close in all three. There are various times where he could have easily been, one of these guys like a Cal Rosenblum or the guy who owns the Wizards and the Caps, so Ted Leonsis, guys who own multiple teams in multiple sports in multiple cities, but he just, for one reason or another, he never actually ends up as a big league owner, but he comes really close.
Yeah. Yeah, like you said. Yeah, I mean, he had an ownership interest in the St. Louis Browns when Vec was the GM, but it was very small, right? He was never at the helm. He owned some shares of the Indians, but basically the Indians made him a scout for black players. But you're right. I think it's astonishing what he was able to accomplish as it is. And I think hopefully on some level, even he realized, I don't think I need to be the GM, the owner for a pro football team, pro basketball team. That was an idea that he did have. But at the end of the day, I think in some cases he tried and couldn't pull it together. In other cases, maybe with the 49ers, he kind of realized, look, my bread and butter is the 49er. I mean, is the Globetrotters. Maybe that's where my attention needs to be.
You have to imagine that he would have found being one of, whether it was 12 or 16 or however many owners in any specific league at the time, he would have found that stifling and frustrating because, especially as we mentioned, how conservative these leagues were then and now, how resistant to change they were. I feel like he really would have soured on the politics of that, pretty quickly.
Well, and Saperstein really he was not a diplomat. I mean, if he thought this, he would blast the NBA. He would talk about how they were making giant mistakes and that their game was boring. And And so, no, he was not, and he was just great copy for the sports writers, but he was annoying to the commissioners, and things like that. So yeah, he would have been a disruptor if they'd had him in. I think they were afraid of him a little bit.
Mhm.
Another thing that a factor is that the Globetrotters by the early 50s, they wanted more consistent opponents. The problem they had is sometimes they would play college teams, sometimes they would play other traveling barnstorming teams, sometimes they would play factory teams. There are all kinds of different teams they played in the first couple of decades that they were of their existence. But the competition was so uneven, and they wanted a game that was close enough to be entertaining. And so that's when they formed the Washington Generals back in 1952. But when they did that, there was an official team that was designated to lose close games to them, which is what that was. I think that they lost credibility as kind of as a sports team, and I think that the NBA, for one, I think viewed them as entirely a show team by that time, and something to stay away from, because if you remember back then, there was all kinds of point shaving scandals and various other things in which made people suspect that sports might not be on the level. So I think that I believe that major sports leagues were a little afraid of Saperstein for that reason. I mean, there's no idea that Saperstein ever did anything, unethical like that, but he was a showman. And so I think that they thought that he might be bad for their credibility.
We're getting up against it here, and we want to thank you both for coming on. Just one more question for me, and this is something that I'm really curious about. And you certainly talk about this a bit in the book, but I'd love to ask you about it. Talk to us a little bit about that evolution, because obviously they didn't start off as, not to use a disparaging word, but as the clown team. But I would imagine that in 2024, the Globetrotters are still around, and I know they are, but they're now almost entirely an entertainment team. They don't play necessarily competitive games, against a Minneapolis Lakers type. So how did that sort of evolve, and when would you say they maybe crossed over from being sort of half competitive and half show to being sort of what they are today, which is like the complete showman's team?
Well, I think Abe wanted it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually a myth that Saperstein, one of the things that he said that's really not true, is that they started out as just a regular basketball team and then became a kind of a comedy team. The truth is they were always, we found a news clip from before they even played their first game in which they're advertising themselves with comic antics. So they were always both, which is something that this book says that other books have not said, because we found out just by looking at news clips that they always claimed that. Abe said the opposite. He said that they decided to become a show team because they were winning by so much that they wanted to keep the fans interested, and that they also felt like if they kept on scoring baskets, they were going to embarrass the other team, and they wouldn't want the Globetrotters, to come back the next year. So that they had to. So that he said that comic antics were to keep the score down, and that some of that may be true, because they wanted it both ways. But I feel like by the 1950s, when the NBA started drafting black players, Saperstein saw the writing on the wall, and he knew that while he had some of the best black athletes in the world, he wasn't going to stay that way, and he was going to because, Sweetwater Clifton, the first NBA player to sign a contract, was a Globetrotter,
former Globetrotter,
and
yeah.
Abe sold his rights, and so he understood that he was going to lose out to the NBA ultimately in that way. I don't think the myth that Saperstein pushed was that they slowly but surely became a comedy team. The truth is they were always both, but they gave all the way over to becoming just a comedy team in the early 50s, when the NBA started being able to get the best black players around, and they formed the Washington Generals to tour with them, which was a totally fake team, a team that was hired to lose, So the credibility went there, and that's what by that time they became a show team. And and a wildly popular one. I mean, the fact that nobody really cared what the score was, I mean, does anyone remember the scores of the Globetrotters games they went to? I don't think so.
Mhm.
That's not what they were anymore. So there was an evolution in their purpose. But Abe still hated to lose, by the way. There was one time in history where the Washington Generals beat the Harlem Globetrotters. And it's because the guy who was the best sharpshooter on the Generals threw a really long shot at the end of the game, and it happened to go in. And he was one of Abe's best friends, but Abe didn't speak to him for weeks after that. He was furious about it.
They probably had a good crowd the next time they came back, though, for the rematch.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah.
Andrew, did you have anything else?
No, I think we covered a lot. I don't want to give too much away from the book. We'll have to make sure we plug it and put the link in.
Absolutely. Well, this was great, guys. Once again, Mark Jacob and Matt Jacob. The book is Globetrotter: How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports. And we want to thank you both very much for joining us tonight.
Well, great
Thanks,
questions.
guys.
Great conversation.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate our listening audience as always, and it's always good to have a guest, or in this case, two guests, and in this case, two brothers, just like we are. So, hope you all enjoyed it. A little talk about a dive back in a number of key moments in the history of sports, all through the story of the great Abe Saperstein. And we will catch you the next time. But until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history. But as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.